All right, thank you very much for joining me here today. I'm Dama. I appreciate you tuning in. And this is what I wanted to talk to you about first in today's episode. With the growing importance of computer chips to power technology, the U.S. is taking direct aim at China's most advanced manufacturers. Sources tell Reuters that the Biden administration is cutting off China's top sanctioned chip maker, SMIC, and its most advanced factory from more American imports. This comes after Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corp helped produce a sophisticated chip for Huawei's Mate 60 Pro phone. The Biden administration is under pressure to stop the flow of U.S. technology to China and to curb the country's ability to make sophisticated chips. In October, the administration effectively banned U.S. suppliers from sending semiconductor tools and materials to Chinese chip makers. It's also reviewing the details behind the Mate 60 Pro chip, which is the most advanced semiconductor China has made so far. Meanwhile, the country is also resorting to more drastic measures to prevent its $8 trillion stock market slump from extending into a fourth year. Sources told Bloomberg News that the China Securities Regulatory Commission has banned major institutional investors from selling more shares than they buy during the first and last 30 minutes of trading. This is part of Beijing's most forceful attempt yet to prop up the market after a sell-off this month pushed China's benchmark CSI 300 index to a 5-year low. So far, there's no indication this will affect individual investors who make up a large portion of volume in Chinese stocks, but sources added that the CSRC is creating a task force to track short selling. And as well, China has found a way to dodge steep U.S. tariffs as the U.S. tries to move away from Chinese goods. Data shows Chinese imports are coming through from Mexico. Trade data analyzed by the Financial Times reveals 20-foot containers shipped from China to Mexico, reaching 881,000 for the first 3 quarters of last year. That's way up from the year before. President Donald Trump slapped hefty tariffs on trade with China to push for a shift of supply chains away from China and reshore manufacturing. President Joe Biden has faced pressure for even tighter measures as Beijing appears to be running trade through Mexico, Vietnam, Singapore, and the Philippines without facing the same levies. There's also concern now over Chinese companies planning to open factories in Mexico, such as EV manufacturer BYD. Meanwhile, Taiwanese fishermen in sensitive waters around frontline islands near the Chinese coast say they're worried about rising tensions after 2 Chinese nationals died during a chase with Taiwan's Coast Guard. Take a look at this story.
Taiwanese fishermen are exercising caution when they go out to work on the sensitive waters around the frontline islands near the Chinese coast. They say they are worried about rising tensions after 2 Chinese nationals died during a chase with Taiwan's Coast Guard. They died when Taiwan's Coast Guard tried to expel their boat, which then overturned. Their vessel had gotten close to an islet that is part of the Kinmen Islands, which has been governed from Taipei since the end of the Chinese Civil War in 1949. A furious China, which claims Taiwan as part of its own territory, responded by launching its own Coast Guard patrols and on Monday boarded a Taiwanese tourist boat operating off Kinmen. Huang Zhonfang, secretary of the Kinmen Fishermen's Association, said members were not yet allowing the situation to deter them from working on the water.
After this incident, fishermen will still be psychologically affected to an extent when they go out to sea. But according to our statistics in the past few days, the number of boats heading out to sea has in fact been normal. If the fishery administration fleet on the mainland comes out, this behavior will cause some pressure on our fishermen while working at sea. They will be afraid because of this. After this incident, the fear of this matter extends to the work of our ordinary fishing boats, which will cause them a lot of stress.
Kinmen is home to around 100,000 people. It also hosts a large Taiwanese military garrison, just a short boat ride from the Chinese cities of Xiamen and Quanzhou. Taiwan's Coast Guard patrols its waters, and several of Kinmen's surrounding islets are heavily fortified and mostly off limits to civilians, including Beijing, the islet where the Chinese boat was overturned. China last week said it recognises no banned or restricted waters for fishermen around Kinmen. Kinmen was the scene of sometimes intense fighting between Taiwanese and Chinese forces during the height of the Cold War, but is today a popular holiday destination, with many tourists drawn to its old bunkers and bullet-pocked wartime sites.
The S&P 500 and Dow Jones Industrial eked out small gains on Wednesday, while the Nasdaq closed lower for a third straight session as investors awaited the release of Nvidia's earnings. Here's a quick recap of markets.
U.S. stocks ended mixed on Wednesday as investors awaited the release of Nvidia's earnings that could determine near-term momentum for equities. The Dow and S&P 500 both eked out marginal gains, while the Nasdaq shed 0.3%. Shares of Nvidia, which closed down more than 2.5%, surged 10% after the closing bell, after it forecast fiscal first-quarter revenue above estimates on robust demand for its industry-leading artificial intelligence chips. Nvidia shares have soared nearly 40% this year, making it the biggest gainer on the S&P 500 after a leap of almost 240% in 2023. Analysts had cautioned that its lofty valuation could make the stock vulnerable to a sharp pullback if the company delivered anything short of a blowout report. George Ball, chairman of Sanders Morris Harris, thinks such scrutiny is overblown given the still nascent field of generative AI.
The NVIDIA phenomenon is almost like the Taylor Swift tour. It's attracted a great deal of attention, and really the logical part of me wonders why. I guess emotionally you can say NVIDIA is a precursor of what's going to happen in the next 30 years. Right now, what it does in the next 30 or 130 minutes is something that the investor and the speculator are focusing on frenetically, and that's probably foolish.
Among other movers, Palo Alto Networks plunged more than 28% after the cybersecurity firm forecast third-quarter billings below analyst estimates. And Amazon edged up nearly 1%, with the company set to join the Dow next week, replacing Walgreens Boots Alliance, which saw its shares decline 2.5%. Meanwhile, minutes from the Federal Reserve's January meeting showed most policymakers were concerned about risks of cutting interest rates too soon, with broad uncertainty about how long borrowing costs should remain at their current level.
And now some quick updates on markets around the world. European shares rose to a record high on Thursday, boosted by a rally in global stocks that also saw Japan's blue chip Nikkei index hit an all-time high. Here's a look.
Europe's Stoxx 600 index rose to almost 496 points in early trade, beyond a previous record set 2 years ago. The European benchmark was up close to 1% by mid-morning. On a busy day for earnings, Rolls-Royce was among the top gainers. The jet engine maker soared over 7% after it said profit more than doubled last year, beating forecasts amid a recovery in global air travel. German automaker Mercedes warned of an unpredictable year ahead due to trade tensions. But its stock still gained over 4% after it announced a big share buyback. Nestlé bucked the trend though, sliding 4%. The food giant missed forecasts as rising prices for its goods put off some shoppers. Even so, global equities have largely risen of late due to a broadly resilient global economy. Markets also hold hopes of interest rate cuts by major central banks later in the year. Europe has also been helped by a surge in large-cap stocks like Novo Nordisk, the maker of hit weight loss drug Wegovy. It's not just Europe and Japan seeing records smashed though. The US S&P 500 is also trading around all-time highs, led by gains in large-cap tech stocks like fast-rising AI chip champion Nvidia.
And here's a closer look at Japanese stocks. It raced to a record peak on Thursday, breaking levels last seen in 1989. This is as cheap valuations and corporate reforms lured foreign money looking for alternatives to battered Chinese markets. Take a look at this.
Japanese stocks hit a record high on Thursday. The moment drew a spontaneous round of applause on the trading floor at Nomura in Tokyo. Decades on from Japan's bubble-era economy, the Nikkei stock index hit the 39,000 mark. The 34 years it's taken to regain the peak is a record for any major market, and it all comes despite recession at home, conflict around the world, and a global inflation shock. The Nikkei was Asia's best-performing major bourse in 2023 and is now up around 17% just this year, almost 3 times the gains for the US Nasdaq index. No single factor has driven the surge. A cheap yen has made Japanese stocks more affordable for overseas buyers. Corporate governance reforms and robust earnings have restored optimism over the country's big firms. That's lured back major investors like Warren Buffett. And some analysts say Japanese stocks just look cheap when measured by price-to-earnings ratios, a common metric for valuations. Back in the bubble era, the ratios went above 50. Now they average barely more than 20. The firms behind the rally also look very different from the banks and property giants that once dominated Japan. Big gainers include Uniqlo parent Fast Retailing and chip gear makers Advantest and Tokyo Electron. Put it all together, and many investors bet the rally has further to run. A Bank of America survey of fund managers showed almost 1 in 3 expect more strong returns for Japanese stocks this year. Analysts at the bank say Japan is by far the favourite market in the region.
And Apple is off the bench and in the game as the tech giant launches its first sports app. iPhone users can now download the free Apple Sports app. The app shares real-time scores and key stats for the NBA, NHL, and MLS and other leagues. Now, the release comes ahead of March Madness, offering real-time data from both men's and women's NCAA basketball. Over time, Apple plans to add more leagues, including the NFL and MLB. Right now, though, the app can only direct users to where games can be watched. The ad-free app has no streaming capabilities yet. And global debt levels have surged and hit a record high. Last year, global debt reached $313 trillion. And compare that to $210 trillion almost a decade ago. The study by Financial Services Trade Group Institute of International Finance found more than half of the rise came from mature markets. The increase was mainly driven by the US, France, and Germany. On the other hand, India, Argentina, China, Russia, Malaysia, and South Africa had the largest increases. This could signal growing challenges in debt repayments. The IIF says borrowing appetite is growing and is concerned that a potential revival of inflationary pressure could result in higher borrowing costs. Now, it's been 30 years since the cost of food ate up this much of your income, according to the U.S. Labor Department. American consumers are now spending 11.3% of their disposable income on food, according to the latest USDA data available. That hasn't happened since President George H.W. Bush was in office. Eating continues to cost more, whether it's in restaurants or takeout or at home. Prices at dining establishments jumped more than 5% last month compared to January. Now, there's little relief to be found at the grocery store, either with cocoa prices reaching a 46-year record in February. Economists believe that food prices are not likely to stabilize soon. While commodities like corn, wheat, and chicken have gotten cheaper, they are being offset by higher prices for sugar, beef, and French fries. President Joe Biden said on Wednesday his administration is canceling another $1.2 billion worth of student loans for nearly 153,000 people who are eligible under a program used to make good on his promises to increase loan forgiveness. Take a look at this report.
U.S. President Joe Biden said on Wednesday his administration will cancel another $1.2 billion in student loans. He was speaking on a trip to California that has been focused primarily on fundraising for his re-election.
While a college degree is still a ticket to a better life, that ticket is too expensive. And too many Americans are still saddled with unsustainable debt in exchange for a college degree.
The latest announcement applies to people enrolled in a repayment program known as Saving on a Valuable Education and covers those who have borrowed $12,000 or less who have been repaying the money for at least 10 years. Recipients of the relief will receive an email from Biden. Last year, the Supreme Court blocked Biden's broader plan to cancel $430 billion in student loan debt. After the decision, Biden, a Democrat, pledged to find other avenues for tackling debt relief. The White House said the administration has now canceled some $138 billion in student debt for millions of people through executive actions. Left-leaning progressive and young voters who support Biden needs to win re-election in November have been vocal in advocating for student loan forgiveness on a wide scale, while Republicans largely oppose such actions.
And tax day is less than 2 months away, and if you haven't filed yet, now might be a good time to start. Tax experts say if you make a mistake, there's still plenty of time to correct it before the April 15th deadline. Here's a look at some common mistakes and how you can avoid them.
Filing your taxes can be a complicated process, and the tiniest mistake can throw everything off. The IRS says common errors include misspelling a name or typing in the wrong Social Security number.
So really important to just make sure you put your information in correctly.
Another common error is choosing the wrong filing status and not listing your dependents correctly, and that can prevent you from receiving tax credits and a bigger refund. Typically, your marital status on the last day of the tax year determines your status for the entire year, and filing jointly can mean a higher refund. Next, do you have dependents? They could include a child or stepchild under 19 or under 24 if they're a full-time student. If you have a family member deemed permanently and totally disabled, you can claim them as a dependent as well. And if your child is under 17, you can receive up to $2,000 per child in tax credits.
I would just encourage people that have kids that are under 17 to still file and get that credit.
Using software like TurboTax or H&R Block can help guide you through this process.
Confer with a tax professional or use, tax software where it's going to guide you through and make those calculations correctly.
If you file early and happen to make one of these mistakes, you'll still have time to fix it. In some cases, the IRS may even notify you about the error.
Ride-hailing service Uber Technologies is continuing with their attempts to implement robot delivery services in densely populated cities. Japan, being the next city, is set to offer the robot service next month. NTD's Sean Marshall has more.
Uber Eats customers in Japan can soon have an autonomous robot deliver their food on the streets of Tokyo. Uber announced a partnership Tuesday between robotics firm Cartken and Japanese multinational electronics giant Mitsubishi Electric to launch autonomous sidewalk robots that will start delivering Eats orders in parts of Tokyo beginning next month. Japan is set to be the second country for Uber Eats to roll out a robot delivery service after the United States. Robot delivery in general has had a couple of problems in the States with people vandalizing them and looting them for food mid-delivery. And one was spotted going through a crime scene in Los Angeles. According to Film the Police LA's X account, the company that operated the robot that went into the police crime scene claims they thought the robot was being waved through. We'll see if Japan's tradition of being extremely courteous and polite will cause less problems than most other countries might run into. Shoji Tanaka, the senior general manager of the Advanced Application Development Center Development Division at Mitsubishi Electric, said, "In the future, we will work with buildings and factory infrastructure, which is one of our strengths, so autonomous robots will be able to deliver inside various facilities." Sean Marshall, NTD News.
Meanwhile, Boeing said on Wednesday it was replacing the head of its troubled 737 MAX program effective immediately. The first major executive departure since the January 5th mid-air panel blowout of a new Alaska Airlines MAX 9. Here's the report.
The MAX program leader, Ed Clark, had been with Boeing for 18 years. He'd overseen production in the Washington state facility where the plane involved in the incident was completed. Clark's departure is part of a larger shakeup Boeing announced on Wednesday, including a new senior position for quality and safety. Regulators have curbed Boeing production, and the company's been closely scrutinized by lawmakers and clients since the January incident. A memo announcing the shakeup from CEO Stan Deal said Boeing was working to ensure that, quote, every airplane we deliver meets or exceeds all quality and safety requirements. The panel blowout had happened on a brand new Alaska Airlines plane. It forced pilots to make an emergency landing while passengers were exposed to a hole 16,000 feet above ground level. The panel serves as a plug on some 737 MAX 9s instead of an extra emergency exit, but the one on the Alaska Airlines jet appeared to be lacking 4 crucial bolts, according to a preliminary report earlier this month. The report also said the door plug in question was removed to repair rivet damage, but there's been no evidence that the bolts were reinstalled. The findings angered Boeing's airline customers, with some, like Alaska Airlines, announcing plans to implement stricter quality checks on planes before they depart the Boeing factory.
And social media platform Reddit plans to sell a chunk of its IPO shares to its platform's users, the Wall Street Journal reported on Wednesday. Here are the details.
Ahead of its highly anticipated stock market debut, social media platform Reddit plans to sell a chunk of its IPO shares to its platform's most prolific users. That's according to a report on Wednesday from the Wall Street Journal, which noted the plan is unusual. The report said 75,000 of its so-called Redditors will have a chance to purchase stock at its initial public offering price before it starts trading next month. That's a privilege normally reserved only for big investors. The San Francisco-based company, which was valued at about $10 billion in a funding round in 2021, declined to comment. Reuters in January reported that Reddit has drawn up detailed plans for its IPO in March. It had filed confidentially for its IPO back in December 2021. Reddit would be the first major social media company to go public since Pinterest's debut in 2019.
American spacecraft Odysseus lander is to attempt a historic moon landing Thursday. This is a U.S.-made craft attempting the first landing since 1972. Here's more on that.
And liftoff.
Just days after lifting off from Florida, Odysseus is now barreling towards the moon, sending back spectacular pictures of Earth along the way, and is now hours away from the most perilous test yet for the robotic lunar lander, a soft or controlled landing on the surface of the moon.
Go for launch.
Intuitive Machines is trying to pull off something no private company has done. And if successful, it will be the first time an American-made spacecraft has done it since the last Apollo mission in 1972.
We are steely-eyed rocket scientists, but deep down, this is quite an emotional feeling to be here at this position.
Just last month, a Pennsylvania company, Astrobotic Technology, had its first lunar landing mission end in failure. And last year, the Japanese company iSpace and the government of Russia both crashed landers into the moon. So why is it so tough to repeat a feat that was first accomplished more than half a century ago?
That's one small step for man.
The biggest reason is also the most frustratingly terrestrial one: money. NASA's budget at the peak of the Apollo program was more than 4% of all U.S. government spending. Today, NASA's budget is 1/10 the size, just 0.4%, even as NASA attempts to return astronauts to the moon under the Artemis program. In an effort to save money, NASA is outsourcing robotic lunar landings to companies like Intuitive Machines for a fraction of what it cost in the 1960s and 70s.
Do it for $100 million. When in the past it's been billions of dollars.
Then there's the purely technical challenge of landing a spacecraft in a specific spot, roughly 250,000 miles away.
Some people have likened it to, hitting a golf ball in New York and having it go into a particular hole in one in LA.
The distance means there's also a time delay, roughly 3 seconds for signals from mission control rooms on Earth to get to the moon and back.
A lot can go wrong in that time. So when the vehicle is actually landing, it pretty much is on its own.
Finally, there's the experience factor, the loss of the Apollo-era expertise that no amount of new technology can make up for.
Simply because somebody else did it in an earlier age doesn't mean that this generation or this organization can do it. These are people doing it for the first time, and there's no substitute for that experience.
We all collectively have to be resilient to failures, and we all have to be helping each other lift up and break down these barriers so that we can begin a lunar economy. That's what this is, a beginning of an emerging economy around the moon.
And thank you very much for watching NTD Business. That's all the stories for today. See you next week.